is, if you're giving her extra hours, she'll be cooking more instead. You're giving her extra. Is that why you change?
Not at all. Not at all. Right.
I'm just kidding.
Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah amma ba'd. Continuing ad-da' wa dawa, we reached the section al-dhulmu min akbar al-kaba'ir 'inda Allah. Injustice is among the greatest of sins, akbar al-kaba'ir, the greatest of the major sins to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is, you see how this is all branching from what we were speaking about for the past few weeks, in that as soon as we have a misunderstanding of who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is, it's not just, oh, you got it wrong here and everything else is a-okay. All of this branches and it keeps trickling outwards. It's like a ripple effect. Right? If one thing is wrong in terms of how we understand Allah, how we know Allah, and it keeps expanding into other wrong things, and it opens up the doors to major ethical and spiritual problems, including shirk, including kibr, arrogance, and now he's talking about injustice. So when you look at shirk, for example, the verses in Surah Al-An'am, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was criticizing Quraysh for some of their shirk practices, where they would sacrifice, and they would dedicate some of their sacrifice to their idols and some of it to Allah. And what would end up happening is they would take that which they gave to Allah, right, and they would say, you know what, Allah doesn't need it, let's go ahead and give it to our idols. Right? Okay, now, is that fair? Is that just? I mean, what's the rationale behind it? It goes back to desires, and thus arrogance. Also, how they categorize their cattle and said some cattle is permissible for women, while other cattle aren't permissible for women. They can't eat it. But if the camel is pregnant and the fetus is dead, ends up being dead, then women can eat it, and all of this nonsense. So basically, they're excluding women in an unjust way. So you see how shirk leads to types and forms of injustices. Right? Also, the arrogance aspect. When you look at Quraysh and, the way of our forefathers, we will never leave the way of our forefathers. I mean, what is that really rooted in? A type of arrogance. My way is always better. It's not about truth. It's not about evidence. It's not about miracles. It's about arrogance. And then from that sprouts injustice. So injustice in terms of what I was mentioning, how they categorized cattle and said some is okay for women, others are impermissible for women, and thus women are excluded unjustly. And it could be maybe lower classes of society. They're excluded unjustly. Like their claim and their statement that وَقَالُوا لَوْلَا نُزِّلَ هَذَا الْقُرْآنُ عَلَى رَجُلٍ مِنَ الْقَرْيَتَيْنِ عَظِيمٍ. Why hasn't this Qur'an been revealed to a noble person, an elite from one of the two great cities of Arabia, meaning Mecca and Ta'if? Right? It's like, who's this guy? وَإِذَا رَأَوْكَ إِن يَتَّخِذُونَكَ إِلَّا هُزُوًا. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, when they look at the Prophet, they mock him. أَهَذَا الَّذِي بَعَثَ اللَّهُ رَسُولًا. I mean, this Allah couldn't find someone else other than him. Arrogance. Also injustice. Well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave it to the Prophet ﷺ. Why? Because he has the character that is necessary to represent Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You all don't. And so look at how they're unjustly trying to distribute Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's mercy, as Allah says, and criticize them. أَهُمْ يَقْسِمُونَ رَحْمَةَ رَبِّكَ. I mean, are they the ones who are going to distribute and say Allah's mercy should go here and shouldn't go there? Look at the arrogance. Look at the injustice. Right. So all of this is sprouting out from what? A misappropriation, a misunderstanding, a poor understanding, a wrong understanding of who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is. Also from that, when a person has arrogance and or an unjust nature, unjust in their behaviors, then this starts opening up the doors of the sins that we know. And the more this is rooted in the heart, then the greater the sin, the doors of the greater sins will be open and open. And thus, Ibn Qayyim rahmatullah alayhi, after talking about this, jumps into murder. مفسدة القتل وإثم فاعله. The mischief caused by murder and the sin acquired by the one who commits murder. Right? So why is he going from kind of arrogance and injustice to murder? Well, because murder is very often rooted in injustice and arrogance. You have arrogance, for example, the elites will kill someone unjustly. When we look at the dictators of let's say, the Arab world, right, they'll kill people unjustly for the purpose of preserving their throne. They will throw people in jail unjustly. Why? To preserve the throne. So these two are tied. Also, someone who heavily believes in shirk, someone who has taken a false ideology and has rooted it in their heart, will fight to preserve that ideology. And so look at the climate here in America in terms of the far right and the far left. I mean, these two are ready for violence. They're ready for violence. And they are ready to go all out. You can hear it in their rhetoric, in their behaviors, in the way they accuse people who don't agree with them. Okay. And so their ideologies are so rooted in the heart that it begins to reinforce and justify killing in order to preserve and to spread their ideology. They justify it. And I've given this story before, but I'll say it again. A Maliki scholar was once walking, and he saw a group of men playing cards and getting drunk. Walked by them, and his students are with him. And then he walks by another group of Sufis, and the Sufis are jumping up and down, and they're doing things that aren't part of Islam. And so this teacher tells his students, the first group, the ones who are drinking and playing cards and doing that stuff, أهون عند الله, are doing smaller sins in front of Allah than the second group. And they were shocked. I mean, how are these people who are drinking and doing clearly haram things better than these Sufis who are worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And his response was beautiful and very important. He said, the first one, they know what they're doing is wrong. They know what they're doing is wrong. No Muslim sitting there drinking alcohol thinking that is perfectly fine. They think they drink it with guilt. And eventually, sooner or later, they repent. And if you go to them and remind them, their response tends to be, may Allah guide us. Make dua for us. Sheikh, we know we're wrong. But the second group, you go to them and you try to advise them, you show the evidence that what they're doing is incorrect, they will do takfir of you, they will fight you, and they're ready to raise the sword against you. Right? And so you see how all of these things, it's like one point leads to something else, leads to something else, leads to something else, leads to something else. This is pretty serious. Actually, this is very serious. And so let's now tie kind of where Ibn Qayyim rahmatullah alayh has been talking, what he's been talking about, to our situation here in America. When you look at someone from the West and you bring them in conversation with someone born and raised in the East, I mean, we can easily see how these two don't view the world in the same way. They don't. It's quite different. It's different. Why? Well, because the ideologies that were planted in their mind, or they were taught, whether in school or by their parents or by society, whatever it is, by the media, is fundamentally different. Right? And so as a result of that, their worldview is very different, and thus the way they speak and what they mean when they speak is different. So when an American-born marries a non-American-born, they have so much trouble communicating. Why? Because it's not just the language, it's the paradigm they were raised in, the worldview that they have developed. It's also different. Right? And then the behaviors. What they expect from other people and what they see as their responsibilities. Right? And so, me growing up, I always remembered how men and their fathers would always prefer to go to the Middle East to find a wife instead of marrying a girl from here. And the reason, right? The reason is that a woman who's born in the East understands her motherly and her wife duties much better than a woman born and raised here. Now, I don't mean to justify, I don't mean to say it's correct, but I just mean to give an example, right? And so this is so important that we better understand the worldview that we live by. Because you see, it's not just a view of life, it's a lifestyle. It's what it becomes. Who we think Allah is not just an issue of this is what I think and that's it. It becomes a lifestyle. Someone who believes that God created the universe but without purpose, meaning there's no such thing as religion. God created the universe, said just do whatever you want. You can see how such a ideology will better fit or will end up being like what we see here in the West. Freedom, I'm not talking about political freedom, I'm talking about social freedom. Freedom in your lifestyle. I do what I want. The Muslim mother tells her daughter, tells her son, you can't do this, and the response is, well, I could do whatever I want. It's a free world. It's a free society. And how, what are you saying? Right? What do you mean it's a free society? What's going on? And parents simply don't know how to deal with this because, well, when they were growing up, it was simply not the case. Right?
My mother still tells me what to do and what not to do.
Yeah.
Grandmother.
Yeah. That's very normal. Right? A 80-year-old mother will tell her 60-year-old son what to do, and they will listen, and they say it's perfectly fine. Right? Yet you have the 7-year-old, mashallah, who thinks that they're an adult and they can do whatever they want, irrespective of the will and the approval of their parents. So it all starts with our belief of who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is. In the Western world, when you look at Western history, you ask the question, how did the West go from this hardcore Christian society to pretty much atheism or polytheism? I mean, this is really the two routes of America now. Now, with all the commotion going on, I mean, it's really quite unclear what the future of America is. And now you have the Christians are all riled up and they're ready to, claim their place back in American society. And they're doing protests and Jesus loves you. And when you see such a protest, it's like, oh my God, I feel threatened. I feel like my life is at stake here. Yet they're saying Jesus loves you. He's come to save you. It's bizarre, right? But generally speaking, how did the West go from hardcore Christianity? I'm not talking about hardcore in terms of fanaticism. I'm talking about hardcore in terms of living by Christianity, right, to pretty much atheism and this far left polytheism. What happened? It didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen with the snap of a finger. It happened bit by bit by bit. It started off as Christian, then deism started coming on the scene, and deism led to atheism, and led. And so we as Muslims, whether you're looking at the self, you're looking as a parent, as a grandparent, we need to ask the question, what kind of worldview am I raising my child to have? How can we start to develop a accurate, a healthy worldview? It starts by teaching the child who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is. It's so important. It's so important. And there's research going on now by two locals about what's called the image of God, the God image. How do we view Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And there's a survey, and you take the survey, and it pretty much gives you a graph of how you view Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And what you find is that Muslims, they view Allah as what's called a cop-like figure. What does that mean? When you're driving and you see a cop, what happens to you? Slow down, better behave. Oh my God, you start looking in the rearview mirror. Did he catch me? He's coming after me. Why? Because what's the purpose of the cop parked on the side of the road, kind of in a corner? What are they doing? Right? No, it's not that they're keeping you on track. They're trying to find you making a mistake. They have to reach a quota, right? Their whole purpose, I'm talking about when they clock, right? When they clock, they're sitting there. The whole purpose is to find you making a mistake. And when they find you, they pull you over and they give you a ticket. You're not getting out of it. That's a cop-like image. So you look at these youth, they view Allah similarly. That Allah is watching, He's waiting for you to make a mistake because He's ready to punish. That's the image they have of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The question is, where is that image coming from? Do you think it's from the books? No, it's coming from the parenting style that they were raised with. Do this or else. Don't do that or else. Okay, mom, why? You have to listen to me because I said so. But mom, I don't think this is right. Nope, you cannot challenge me. This is it, period. And if you dare get caught and they're spying, the mother will go and spy and look and, right? This is where it's coming from, the parenting style. And so our children and many, even, your generation as well, they view Allah as a type of cop. He's there to wait for us to slip, and then bam, He's going to zap us. And you find that we're weaker in viewing Allah as an assistant, meaning not assistant like I'm the boss and I have an assistant, like someone who assists us. I can depend on Allah to help me in my situation. Our youth, we don't view Allah in that way. Why? Because we're so focused on the fear element and we forget about Allah's assistance. He's there to help. You need anything? Call upon me. I'm here to help. I sent you messengers, I sent you the Quran, I gave you this and I gave you that to assist you. We don't see that. Also in terms of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's nearness. People don't feel Allah as near. He's close to me. He cares about me. He's concerned about me. He wants what's best for me. Why? Because we're so focused on the fear. And then you see how that affects our lifestyle, our relationship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I do my salah because I'm afraid Allah is going to throw me in hellfire. That's not invalid, right? But as we mentioned before, there's higher levels, better levels of engaging Allah. I worship Allah in hope that Allah will reward me. And even higher than that, I worship Allah because I love Him. And even higher than that, I worship Allah because of His beauty. And even higher than that, I worship Allah in reverence to Him, subhanahu wa ta'ala. But in order to reach these higher levels, we need to have a proper, balanced understanding of who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is. If we don't have that, you see the trickle effect. It can lead to murder, of course, not in the Muslim concept, but in terms of when you get to shirk and these other forms. And murder leads to, murder also comes from zina. Ibn Qayyim then starts talking about mafsadat az-zina, the mischief caused by fornication and adultery. Right? How it's connected to murder is that a lot of murder happens because of what? People were with the wrong people. I mean, can you imagine in Eastern culture? I mean, we don't need to imagine. It happens. In Eastern cultures, what's called honor killings, right? I caught my daughter with a guy, and she's killed by her family out of shame. Or I caught my wife somewhere else, or my husband, or whatever, and that leads to murder. No, but the other family can kill him. He was with my daughter. I'm going to go kill him. So murder and zina are very closely associated. And this is why in the Quran you constantly find these two paired, because one leads to the other. When fornication becomes widespread in more conservative countries, then killing and murder and revenge murders go on the rise. And also when you look at shirk and the idea of shirk and how it goes back to desires and the worship of desires, and I believe I explained this in a previous session. Right? Oh, we'll give this to Allah and give this to the idols. You know what? No, let's go ahead and change that around. And okay, when it comes to camels, everyone can eat from it, but if the camel is pregnant, then women can't eat from it. I mean, what is that going back to? It's not going back to logic. It makes no sense. What kind of logic is that anymore? Why is it that it's permissible for everyone if it's not pregnant, but impermissible if it is pregnant, impermissible to women if it is pregnant? What kind of logic is that? I mean, does it go back to science that somehow, women are their bodies react negatively to to eating the meat of a camel that's pregnant? Is that the case? Is there some sort of psychological element here? Some sort of emotional harm that happens to the woman? What's the logic behind? There is no logic. And therefore, what does it go back to? It goes back to desires. And so when shirk is rooted in a person's heart, in a society, desires just are everywhere. And again, this is why I see the far left as moving towards polytheism. Because the far left here in America is desire-based. Do whatever you want, love whoever you want. You can be a woman today, a man tomorrow, nothing after that. You can be all of them together the day after that. Just do whatever you want. As Toucan Sam would say, follow your nose wherever it goes. That's what it is. It's a worship of desires. You are what you feel, and you should honor that. And if you don't honor it, then you're betraying yourself. It's worshiping of the self. That's what it is. And when desires have such a grand place in the person's heart, well, one of the greatest human desires is what? The opposite gender, or whatever they want, right? Whatever gender they pursue, whatever, But zina becomes a very important part of that experience. Look at hippies, for example. Hippies and their meditations and all that stuff. I mean, they're the ones who kind of launched the sexual revolution, where, we want to express our love to our girlfriend, our boyfriend, through these behaviors, desires. Right? And so, desire and zina, how it's connected back to shirk and ideology. Whereas a believer, they believe in Allah and they have an accurate believing of Allah. One of those principles is that Allah created things for a purpose. Everything has a purpose. My eyes have a purpose. My ears have a purpose. My nose has a purpose. My mouth has a purpose. My hands have a purpose. Everything in the human body has a particular purpose. Allah created it that way. And so using it for something that it wasn't created for becomes problematic to the person. Why? Because, Allah didn't create it for that reason. I shouldn't do it. And thus, every sin is an injustice. Every sin is an injustice. Looking at something haram is an injustice. Why? Because you are using your eyes for something it wasn't created for. When a person eats something haram or drinks something haram, that's an injustice. Why? Because you're using your mouth for something it wasn't created for. When you say something that is false, intentionally, when you say a lie, you use vulgar language, that's not why your tongue was created. Your tongue was created to worship Allah. And then for you to benefit and use it for your day-to-day affairs. That's what it was created for. So the injustice that comes from that, and so when you look at the opposite gender, right? Allah created man, Allah created female. We need one another, as the Prophet ﷺ says, "An-nisa shaqa'iqur rijal." Women complete men. They complete their other half, and vice versa. Men complete women. Right? Why did the Prophet say women complete men, not men complete women? Well, because the challenge they were going through was what? What is really the status of women in Arabian society and most societies, right? What is the status of women? So the Prophet is lifting the status of women in the minds of Muslims by saying, she completes you. You are not complete without her. Instead of thinking, I'm the boss, I'm complete, and women are there for my own convenience, and if it's not convenient anymore, then I don't need her. Right? But that's a side point. Right? So when we have this view that Allah created everything with a purpose, and thus women have a purpose, men have a purpose, and sometimes the purpose is completed together, well, it is unjust for a man to speak to a woman in an unregulated manner. You are doing her harm as she is doing you harm. But you have marriage. That is just. Allah created men and women, and Allah instituted the institution of marriage so that men and women are able to fulfill the purpose. That is mawadda wa rahma, right? Intimate love and mercy and sukoon, sakina, to find tranquility with one another. And part of that marriage is to build a family, to support each other. That can't happen outside of the marriage institution, outside of this agreement, this contract, that I understand my obligations and duties as a husband, and she understands her obligations and duties as a wife, right? And so when you view the world from this lens, Allah created it for a purpose, and everything has a purpose. Now it's easier for us to reject dating. These young ones come, I want to date. What's so wrong about dating? We're not going to do anything. We're just going to talk. We want to feel affection with one another. I understand, right? But is that the affection was meant to be more regulated and more permanent through marriage? Whereas when it's outside of marriage, unregulated, it always leads to something else. You cannot have a boyfriend-girlfriend relationship that doesn't eventually lead to, even more haram things, except very rarely. But you're not going to take the exception and make it the rule, right? And so it's simply not going to happen. But on top of that, ask yourself the question, these young ones, ask yourself the question, what is the future of your relationship? Right? What is the future of your relationship? Do you really see this as going into marriage? Most of the time it's not. These young ones, when they're dating, they know it's temporary. But do you know what the effects, the long-term effects of dating is? Well, once you actually get married, you've already experienced it all. There's nothing unique about your relationship with your wife. It's gone. And so the problems begin. Divorce rates go high. Why? Because, what am I benefiting from this? What is unique about this other person? I can find it elsewhere. And so the institution of marriage begins to dissolve. And that's very problematic. Okay. And then now Ibn Qayyim rahmatullah alayh, see, this recording is... Ibn Qayyim rahmatullah alayh then goes into كيف تدخل المعاصي على العبد. Let's go ahead and pause here for a second. So now Ibn Qayyim rahmatullah alayh begins to address where sins come from. Right? We spoke about the philosophy or the ideology which sins can be rooted in. Now we're going to talk about the more practical side. Where is this coming from? What do people do that opens up these doors, and what can we do to shut them and keep them shut? Now he says, rahmatullah alayh, that the four things we mentioned in the previous sections, they're really the roots and the essence of all evil. What four are they? They are kibr, arrogance, dhulm, injustice, qatl, murder, and zina, adultery and fornication. And so, where is this coming from? Well, one door of sins is what's called al-lahadat, is looking, observation. When we look at things, right, what we see affects us. Everything we look at affects us. Right? When you look at food, what happens to you?
You want to eat it.
You want to eat it, right? It can arouse that desire for food. And of course, the smell, your nose makes it that much more interesting. The idea is that when you look at it, you're affected by it. Something happens. We are surrounded by books. When you look at the books, what happens? You get some thoughts. Man, I would like to read more. I wonder what's in these books. Am I really not doing a good job because I haven't read more books? Something happens, right? Or some people might feel guilt, or some people might feel, man, what a waste of time. But the idea is when we look at something, it affects us. And it has to. And so what we look at heavily impacts us, and thus, if we're looking at things that are haram, then it's going to enter into our heart, and it's going to make staying away from sin that much more difficult. And as Ibn Qayyim rahmatullah alayh describes our sight, هي رائد الشهوة ورسولها. It is the way of desires, meaning it is the channel of desires, and it is the messenger of desires. Right? What comes what we see enters our hearts, and it foments something, it arouses something. So what happens when we start looking at things that arouse our desires? And what if those things that we are looking at are haram? Right? This is a huge challenge. وَحِفْظُهَا أَصْلُ حِفْظِ الْفَرْجِ. And preserving our sight, managing, regulating what we look at, is the essence of managing our gender relationships. He says something else. I'm just going to put it a little bit more broadly. Right? It is the essence of managing gender relationships. It is the essence of preserving the family, the husband and wife relationship. And then he says, فَمَنْ أَطْلَقَ بَصَرَهُ وَأَوْرَدَ نَفْسَهُ مَوَارِدَ الْهَلَكَاتِ أَوْرَدَ نَفْسَهُ مَوَارِدَ الْهَلَكَاتِ. He says, whoever does not regulate what they look at, then they are feeding themselves the toxins that will destroy them. You want to be destroyed? Look at whatever you want. And so the Prophet says, عليه الصلاة والسلام, لا تتبع النظرة النظرة فإنما لك الأولى وليست لك الأخرى. The Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام says, do not follow looking at one thing by continuing to look at that. Meaning, when you see something you're not supposed to be looking at, guy's walking, a girl walks by, and he looks. What does the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام say? That first look, not the first intentional look, that first accidental look, right? That is, you're not accountable for that. You're forgiven for that. So don't continue to look at that, because if you continue to look at that, then it's held against you. And in another hadith, the Prophet ﷺ says, النظرة سهم مسموم من سهام إبليس فمن غض بصره عن محاسن امرأة لله أورث الله قلبه حلاوة إلى يوم يلقاه. The Prophet ﷺ says, sight is an arrow that is poisoned by Iblis. So you have that whole idea of Cupid, and Cupid's floating around this baby in a diaper, right? And mashallah, people's love, right, and their gender relationships are being determined by a baby in diapers, which tells you a lot in of itself. But he goes and he flies around, and he hits someone with an arrow, and he ends up loving some bunny or girl or whatever it is, right? And they have the concept of Cupid. In Islam, there is a similar concept, but it's not Cupid, it's Iblis. And it's not an arrow of love, it's an arrow of poison. Iblis seeks to destroy us by poisoning our heart and our mind with ishq, with intense attraction to someone who is not halal for us. And then that attraction will occupy the person's mind and the person's heart, distract them. They can't think about anything else, they can't do anything else, they're just in wonderland as a result of this. So it is a poisoned arrow that has been poisoned by Iblis. When a person looks at something haram, Iblis is standing there, or the shaitan is standing there, and poisons that sight, that which is coming back to you, poisons it to poison your heart. And so whoever lowers their gaze from the adornments of a woman for the sake of Allah, the main problem is men looking at women. That's the main problem. When women look at men, I don't think it's as intense and as powerful as when a man looks at a woman. And from my own observations and from what I've been taught and learned, men are more impacted by their sight, what they look at, whereas women are more impacted by what they hear. Right? And so women like to hear their husband say, "Oh, you're beautiful, and you look so lovely, and you're this and that." They're attracted by that. Whereas men, they want to see their wife, they want to look at their wife. That's what impacts them. So, yes, women are obligated to lower their gaze from certain parts of the man, but it's the men that really struggle with this, and it's the men who are more impacted by that. Again, not to downplay women lowering their gaze, but to really emphasize men lowering their gaze, which you barely ever hear about in masajid. I don't think I've ever heard a khutbah in the West about lowering one's gaze. I'm not saying there aren't, but you don't really hear about this topic. And it's so important, especially in our times when women are going on TikTok and wearing, the most lewd and absurd things in order to get, likes and shares and followers. So it's very trying times. And so a man who does this for the sake of Allah, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will put a type of halawa, type of sweetness in their heart until the day of judgment. There's a lot of benefit in lowering one's gaze. And as I mentioned, when we regulate what we look at, we're preserving the family. We're preserving gender relationships to the extent that a man who practices lowering his gaze will always see his wife as beautiful. Always. And will always enjoy the presence of his wife. But a man who's looking here and looking there and seeing this and observing that, now he's comparing his wife to all these other women, he loses that relationship. And that's one of the punishments, to be quite frank. Right? So very important. And the Prophet ﷺ says, إِيَّاكُمْ وَالْجُلُوسَ عَلَى الطُّرُقَاتِ. Do not sit on paths and roads. Where people walk and where people drive and where people kind of transport themselves, do not sit in these places. قالوا يا رسول الله مجالسنا ما لنا بد منها. They said, Ya Rasulullah, we kind of have no choice sometimes but to sit on the path. Right? So for example, if you're traveling, you're in the wilderness, you're not going to go to the outskirts and be in wild land where a predator can attack. You might need to sit on the road, or maybe there's nowhere else to sit but on the road. I used to always complain when I was in Jordan about the sidewalks. Why? Because you have these sidewalks, and these sidewalks are full of trees. You can't walk on it. So you have sidewalks that you can't walk on it, so you have to walk on the road. And then you have all the cars parked on the road, so now you get into the kind of a little bit more inside the road, and the cars are going left and right and flying everywhere. Like, what is this? It's not safe. But the idea is that sometimes you find no place to sit but on the road. So the Prophet ﷺ says, if there's no other place to sit but the road, then give the road its rights. And they said, Ya Rasulullah, what is its right? He said, غَضُّ الْبَصَرِ, lower your gaze. Which tells you what, by the way? This whole notion that women were just kind of in their homes, not doing anything, and you cannot go outside. If that was the case, then why would the Prophet ﷺ say lower your gaze? We conclude that, or we can extrapolate from this, that women were going and doing business, whatever they were doing, right? Going to their parents' home, going and running errands, whatever it is. So it's pretty normal. So lower your gaze. وَكَفُّ الْأَذَى, don't bother people. وَرَدُّ السَّلَامِ, and say salamu alaykum, or reply to people when they say assalamu alaykum.
Even if the woman is covered from top to bottom, from head to toe, she wears not abaya but burqa, it has two pieces.
Mm-hmm.
As soon as she walks by, men, they just drop everything and just she's
right.
covered.
Right. She's covered, right?
She's covered.
Right. So you might think, okay, well, what's the point? There still is a point. Can you compare that to a woman, as you see in Spectrum Mall, wearing these, what are they called, these leggings and these half tops, and they're just walking around everywhere, and it's not the same. It's not the same.
It's shocking that you see nothing but black two-piece, and yet you drop everything, and you just
That's just poor character.
what is this?
It's poor character. And Ibn Qayyim rahmatullah alayhi says, وَمِنْ آفَاتِ النَّظَرِ, among the harms of looking at that which is haram, أَنَّهُ يُوَرِّثُ الْحَسَرَاتِ وَالزَّفَرَاتِ وَالْحَرَقَاتِ, that when you look at that which is haram, what does it leave behind? What is the residue of that in the person's heart? It leaves this type of regret. I wish I had that. Oh my God, why did I marry my wife? I wish my wife was more beautiful. Right? Or this feeling of guilt. I can't control myself. I'm an animal. Looking left and right. And what am I doing? And she's, this or that, or what's going on? And it kind of creates this type of negative emotional cycle, as well as haraqat. It burns. I want that, but I can't have it. I want it. What should I do? So it creates this fire, or this fire that causes them to actually pursue what they're looking for. One time when I was at the mall, you had this young lady, wearing clothes that were revealing, and a group of 3 young men, right? The same age range, right? So, you see the young men go, oh my God, look at her and whatnot. And then two of them encourage the third one, go and get her number, go and get her number. So he goes, approaches her, and kind of touches her, and says, hey, can I get your number? She's like, oh yeah, bam, bam. In a matter of like 5 seconds, this guy got her number. Right? So the fire can be used as a type of fuel to go and pursue the haram. So this is what happens when a person does not regulate what they're looking at. So the first door of sins is our sight, what we're looking at. The less we regulate it, the more doors of sin are opened. The more we regulate it, the more the doors of sins are closed. Also, the reward is the halawah, the sweetness that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala puts in our heart, the preservation of the family, the preservation of the self and the morals and the dignities and the ethics, and the opposite holds true as well. When a person looks at whatever they want and exposes the human body, and people, we cannot but conclude that these women intentionally wear these clothing to attract men. There's no other explanation other than that. They intentionally do it. Maybe there are some women who are naive, they don't know, it's not their intention. But, as some have said, right, women's clothing are designed by men for men. Women's clothing are designed by men, marketed to women for men. Okay. And so we cannot but conclude that this is all meant for the pleasure of the man. Okay. We say in Islam, wear that stuff at home. Woman, be female and show her femininity at home. Outside, deal with the realities of being outside. Nothing wrong with a woman, a Muslimah, being strong, being committed, being tough in her personality when she's outside in the business world, in the market, and doing these things. But when you go home, that's where a woman should be a woman, and keep it to home. So the sight. Should we stop here? Let's go ahead and stop here. صلى الله على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله.